Somewhere right now, a man is living under a name that isn't his, sleeping in a house he paid for with money that, on paper, doesn't exist. And the strange part? The FBI knew where he was for over a year before they made a single move. Why would investigators sit on a target for that long? Either they were building something bigger than one arrest, or they weren't sure, even then, who they were actually chasing. Here's the paradox at the center of this case. The man they eventually caught wasn't the one who built the operation. He was a decoy, and he didn't know it. So who did? That question sat unanswered inside the Bureau for years, buried under a mountain of false leads deliberately planted to look real. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because the method used to build that false trail wasn't some rare, exotic hacking technique. It's a method still active today, embedded in tools millions of ordinary people use without a second thought. Somewhere in the data of this case is a mistake, one single human mistake that unraveled a scheme worth tens of millions of dollars. Investigators still don't publicly agree on what that mistake actually was. What we do know is this. By the time the FBI understood the true shape of the operation, it wasn't shrinking. It was still growing, spreading through systems its architects insisted couldn't be touched. And the cryptographers brought in to break it weren't fighting code. They were fighting a person who had already anticipated their every move because he had studied them first. Which raises the question. This entire story is built around the question no official report has ever fully answered. Was this one man's obsession, or was he working for someone who was never caught? Before we get to how it ended, you need to understand how it began with a warning that was ignored, a whistleblower nobody believed, and a decision made in a windowless room that would come back to haunt the people who made it. To understand how this worked, forget everything you know about hackers in hoodies breaking through firewalls. This attack didn't start with a keyboard. It started with a phone call, polite, calm, and completely unremarkable. The man on the other end wasn't asking for a password. He was asking for a favor, a small one, the kind of favor coworkers do for each other 20 times a day. This is the part almost no one talks about. The most effective attackers don't exploit computers first. They exploit routine, the 1,000 tiny automatic decisions people make without thinking, because thinking is exhausting and trust is efficient. And here's the hidden clue investigators would later circle back to, again and again. The caller knew details he shouldn't have. A recent system update, a manager's name, a minor internal joke. Someone had done homework, and none of it came from hacking. It came from watching. Psychologists call it borrowed authority, when someone doesn't need real power, only the appearance of it, a confident tone, correct jargon. The assumption that questioning him would be the awkward move, not answering him. Ask yourself honestly, if someone called you today, addressed you by name, referenced your actual project, and asked for just a quick confirmation, would you hesitate? Most people don't. That's not stupidity. That's how trust is designed to work. Here's the contradiction that should unsettle you. The employee who granted that first small favor was considered one of the most careful people in the building, meticulous, rule-following. She had passed every security training the company offered, which means the attackers weren't looking for the careless. They were looking for the trustworthy, because trustworthy people are trusted, and trust, once given, rarely gets checked twice. Over the following weeks, the same technique repeated itself in different departments, each time dressed differently: an urgent vendor request here, a routine audit there. No single person saw the pattern. Each one only saw their own, isolated, perfectly reasonable interaction. This is the betrayal at the heart of the story, not a betrayal by one person, but by a system that never asked departments to compare notes. The attackers understood something the company's own leadership hadn't fully accepted. Security isn't broken by one weak link. It's broken by 100 people, each following the rules perfectly, in isolation. And that's when the unexplained behavior started. Files accessed outside business hours. Login attempts from cities where no employee had ever traveled, small enough to dismiss. Except one analyst knew, junior, and not yet trained to look away, didn't dismiss it. She flagged it. Nobody responded for 6 days. When someone finally did open her report, they didn't find one anomaly. They found a pattern stretching back months, touching departments that were never supposed to intersect, moving money in amounts small enough to avoid alarms, and pointing toward an internal account no one could explain. That was the moment someone in that building finally said the sentence that would define the next 3 years of investigation. This isn't a mistake. Someone built this on purpose. Once the report reached the right desk, the case stopped being an internal HR matter and became something else entirely, a federal one. And the agents who opened that file did what forensic investigators always do first. They didn't look at the crime. They looked at the timeline. The first anomaly was small, a server timestamp that didn't match the login it was supposed to belong to, off by exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds, every single time. Too consistent to be a glitch. Too small to be an accident. Then investigators found something impossible. The 4-minute offset wasn't a bug in the system. It was a signature, a deliberate delay built into the code, designed so that anyone auditing the logs later would see activity that looked like it came from a different time zone entirely. Which meant one thing: whoever built this didn't just anticipate getting caught, they planned for it years in advance. A subpoenaed internal document, later cited in court filings, described the discovery in blunt terms. The offset had been present in the system for over 3 years before anyone noticed. 3 years of transactions, quietly mistimed, quietly hidden in plain sight. A witness, an IT contractor who briefly worked on the system early on, later told investigators something that didn't make it into the official press release. He remembered raising a question about the 4-minute thing, once, informally, to a supervisor. He was told not to worry about it. But the most disturbing detail came later, when forensic analysts traced the offset code back to its origin and discovered it hadn't been written from scratch. It had been copied, almost line for line, from a technique documented in a completely unrelated case on the other side of the country 5 years earlier, which raised a question that changed the shape of the entire investigation. Was this one person's idea, or was it a method being passed along quietly inside a network investigators didn't know existed? Agents pulled records from the earlier case. What they found didn't just connect 2 crimes, it connected 2 people who, on paper, had never met, never worked together, and had no documented reason to know each other at all. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. A financial trace one investigators almost didn't run, because the amount involved seemed too small to matter, led to an offshore account that had also appeared, briefly, in a third, still open federal case. 3 separate cases, 3 different cities, 3 sets of investigators who had never spoken to each other, all quietly circling pieces of what was starting to look like the same operation. And that's when the lead investigator on this case wrote the sentence that would quietly reroute the entire task force. This was never 3 cases. It was 1, and it was still active. For months, the task force operated on a single assumption. They were hunting a criminal network built to steal money. That assumption was about to collapse. Because when investigators finally cross-referenced the offshore account with internal banking compliance records, they found something no one expected. The account hadn't just received stolen funds. It had been flagged, internally, over a year earlier, and then quietly cleared. Who clears a flagged account with this much money moving through it without asking a single follow-up question? The answer, when it came, didn't point to a rogue employee. It pointed to a compliance officer with an unremarkable record, a reasonable explanation on file, and a signature that matched hundreds of other routine approvals that same month. On paper, nothing stood out. But investigators noticed something else, a pattern buried under the routine. That same officer had cleared 3 other flagged accounts over 2 years, each one later connected, however loosely, to the growing web of cases the task force was now treating as one. Coincidence or something else? Investigators wouldn't say publicly, but internal notes, later disclosed in court filings, used a very different word: pattern. Here is which reframes every earlier scene in this story. The whistleblower who was ignored, the 6 days of silence, the 4-minute offset no one questioned. None of it was simple negligence. Each delay had a place to hide inside a system that, when it mattered most, chose not to look. And that raises the question investigators still won't fully answer on the record. Was this one compliance officer acting alone, or was she protecting someone above her? Because the money that moved through those cleared accounts didn't stay in one place. Some of it, forensic accountants later traced, flowed toward a private foundation, one whose board included a name investigators recognized immediately from a completely different part of the case, a name nobody in this story was supposed to know. Investigators now faced a version of this case none of them had signed up for, not a theft ring, but a question about who, at the very top, may have known this was happening the entire time, and let it continue. That question remains, to this day, only partially answered, because the one person who could have confirmed it outright has never been formally charged, never testified, and has not spoken publicly about any of this in nearly a decade. Here is what the official case file eventually closed on: a handful of convictions, a modest recovery of funds, and a public statement describing the matter as resolved. That word resolved is doing more work than it should, because the 4-minute timestamp offset that hid 3 years of activity, that technique still works. It hasn't been patched out of existence. It's simply been documented, which means anyone who reads the right report can learn it. The compliance gap, the quiet decision to clear a flagged account without a follow-up question, isn't unique to one institution. Audits conducted since this case have found similar gaps at other organizations, in other industries, still open. And the psychological method at the center of all of it: borrowed authority, manufactured routine, the simple fact that trust is easier to give than to verify, doesn't require a hacker at all. It requires a phone, a name, and 5 minutes of patience. This is not a warning about criminals. It's a fact about systems. Most organizations are not designed to catch a threat that behaves exactly like normal behavior. That was true before this case. It remains true now. You don't need to work in